Hi, this is Dex Gelfand, and I want to give you a little information that is known through my practice of therapeutic spiritual counseling. And it's what could be called fleeting success. Through many different practices, I'm sure this occurs, different types of therapeutic or alternative or spiritual approaches, where there is a moment where a process or technique results in a feeling of being completely released and liberated from some sort of troubling condition, and it feels wonderful. But sometimes, in fact, quite commonly, it can come back very shortly thereafter, like maybe less than 24 hours later or the next day or something like that. And so it feels very self-defeating. It feels very disheartening. It feels like nothing has been accomplished, but actually something has been accomplished. And that is one of my discoveries and one of the key points of therapeutic spiritual counseling. We create these sort of mechanisms that can hold undesirable conditions in place because we come up with some protective or defensive idea that these serve us in some way. They protect us from something. One example is, as long as the anxiety keeps me on my toes. That would be one example. A person could be suffering from anxiety, and I can run them through a very simple technique, like resolution technique. It's a very simple matter to relieve the anxiety through the technique of spiritual digestion, which is part of the resolution technique and other techniques I use. And that circumstance or condition, it seems fine now, and it is. But then what can happen is maybe the next day or sometime shortly thereafter, it returns. And if it does return, then that means that you have what we call a stubbornly held protective attitude, something that puts this back in place, that says it protects you in some way. You need it. Like the example I gave of the anxiety keeps me on my toes. Or as long as I expect failure, I won't be disappointed. There are a lot of these different things like that. They show up in different ways. If I feel sad and depressed, people will be nice to me. Endless variations of this. So the thing that needs to be done, it's very important to understand when something seems like it's only fleeting success. Another principle understood through my work in therapeutic spiritual counseling is that asking for a positive, inviting the person to experience or have the idea of something they desire, a way they desire to be, or relief from something, that it will flush up to the surface whatever holds it in place, whatever internal oppositions exist in a person. And frankly, one of my discoveries is that all there is to process is our own internal oppositions. But I'll try to keep this relatively brief to make the point. And the point is that we have these mechanisms, psychology would call it a defense mechanism. Other practices or approaches refer to it differently. Like it's essentially going to be described as an image of something with feelings that we hold in place. Another word for image is facsimile, that serves us in some way. So an archaic way of referring to this, which only has a superficial understanding of this, that we generate ourselves, this internal opposition to relieving ourselves of something, would be a service facsimile, a mental image that we hold in place of something that's really undesirable. But a more descriptive and accurate term, better than defense mechanism, which isn't too bad, or service facsimile, which is kind of not even easy to understand and superficial, stubbornly held protective attitude. It's a rigid idea. And what a processor, what a counselor, what a therapist needs to understand about this, and what you need to understand about this, is that when in whatever you're doing, whatever practice or technique you're doing, you do experience something seems to be relieved, something seems to be gone, and not be a problem anymore, okay, that something meaningful has occurred, even if it's ephemeral, even if it doesn't last, okay. It then flushes to the surface, if you know to ask for it, the stubbornly held protective attitude. that actually holds this condition in place. And the way I would do that, and the way I do it in my techniques, is to say, is there some thought or attitude or idea you have that this condition should stay as it is, that it is of some protective value, that it protects you from something, that it must be maintained? I mean, you could phrase it a little bit differently, but that's how I say it. Okay, and it doesn't take more than a minute. In fact, a few seconds usually. The person say yes, and you discover that you've got this idea that, holding on to this undesirable condition protects you from something that you think would be worse. But actually, it's just an undesirable condition. And so, by discovering this, we get the exact wording of it, and then it becomes easy to process. Through the technique of the stubbornly held protective attitude technique, we have you examine it, we have you define it, we have you take a look at the circumstances in which you would resort to putting this attitude and holding on to this condition, put it in place, what would trigger it, and process some of the undesirable feelings of that out so that you can more rationally then evaluate it. We'll then take a look at what the consequences of this attitude, let's say it's the example I gave of the anxiety keeps me on my toes. We say, what have the consequences been of maintaining the attitude of anxiety keeps me on my toes? And when invited to do that, you will then see all the ways that it's no good, that it's not something good to hold on to, that this attitude doesn't serve you well. In fact, that it doesn't really make sense. And that's where you will come to. I will ask you then, how does that attitude, or maintaining that attitude, seem to you now? And the answer will be, I don't need it, or something like that. It normally will be, I don't need it, it's silly. It actually does the opposite of what it's intended to do. It makes things worse. In some cases, you will not be ready to dispense with the attitude at that point. And what that means is that there is a more basic, connected, stubbornly held protective attitude that holds the other one in place, which I would simply ask for. Is there some attitude you have that says you must maintain the anxiety keeps me on my toes? Is there some underlying attitude that holds that one in place? And it can be, yes, you're most vulnerable when you think you're safe, or something, whatever it happens to be, okay? But there will be, if it doesn't resolve, if you can't dispense with the stubbornly held protective attitude that arises first, it means there's an underlying one. Go through the same process with that one of examining the circumstances that would trigger your use of that. Take a look at all the consequences that have occurred from that, and then say, well, how does that seem to you now? How's that working for you? What sense does it seem to make now? And it's possible there could be another one underlying that. But regardless, you get to the bottom of that to the point where you can say that you can dispense with that attitude. And then we will also go and process any underlying undesirable conditions, which there will be one if you haven't already processed it, that coming up with these stubbornly held protective attitudes was a solution to it. Something was too painful to experience in some way, too much fear, whatever it is. So you came up with some attitude that essentially said, I'm not going there no matter what, or I'm going to maintain this undesirable feeling so that I don't feel something worse, whatever it might be, okay? And then when we process, as we're processing the stubbornly held protective attitude, at any time we were doing that, we're kind of breaking through that wall you put up to prevent you from accessing what you really need to process, the pain and fear. And once that starts to happen, at any time during the procedure, that pain and fear, some circumstance could come front and center for you. And with therapeutic spiritual counseling, we always take what we get. So if that arises for you now, we will resolve that and then get back to resolving the stubbornly held protective attitude. But sometimes what you need to understand if you come to me or somebody who practices what I do is that at that time when you feel completely free of whatever that undesirable condition is, and then you feel like that was just a fleeting relief later and it comes back, it doesn't mean your time was wasted. It doesn't mean you didn't accomplish something. It means that we are now open. The stubbornly held protective attitude that's been holding that in place can now be asked for. It is now accessible. And once we process that, you won't continue to generate this undesirable condition. As I said, all there is to process is your own internal oppositions. They hold everything in place. So if in a session it arises that something appears to be completely gone, and then you feel it again later, it doesn't mean anything's gone wrong. It doesn't mean what you accomplished was only an illusion, or it didn't really happen, or it didn't mean anything. It meant that now we can get to something deeper that anchors those undesirable feelings in place, and we can uproot it and really root it out. It's progress. If you feel the release from something and then you feel it later coming back, if you're coming to me or somebody I've trained, it's recognized as progress, because now we can get to something deeper. These stubbornly held protective attitudes can be very pervasive, and it's really liberating to be free of these. And following this path and this procedure has never ever failed. So don't be discouraged, don't take it the wrong way if you seem to be completely relieved of something and then it returns. If you're not with somebody who practices what I practice, it doesn't even mean that they failed, but they may not know what I know or somebody I've trained knows, is that what you have to look for next is not more of the same thing or an earlier incident or something like that, but the stubbornly held protective attitude, which will now grant you a wider sphere of relief than what you experienced in the fleeting relief that you got before. But it's a step in that direction if therapeutic spiritual counseling is applied. So you can look back on any experiences you had in whatever type of therapeutic, spiritual, or therapy approach you had, where you felt relief and then it came back. Maybe you felt like, now I'm never going to be rid of it because even when it seems to be gone, it comes back. No, that's not what's happening. You've actually made progress, okay? Then you have to look for a different type of thing, the attitude that holds it in place. So you should be the opposite of discouraged. If you felt relief, whether or not it's sustained, it's meaningful. If it's not sustained, it's an opportunity to go deeper and root out something that's going to even make your life and your attitude and your consciousness even greater. So the whole point is, don't take it the wrong way if something that seemed to be gone comes back. Just continue on with myself or somebody who practices therapeutic spiritual counseling, and just know there's something in you, there's an idea, an attitude that wants this thing to persist, and it's just a matter of deconstructing and reevaluating that attitude. Thanks for listening. Have a great day. And you can see my website, dexsessions.com, DEXSESSIONS.com, for more information or to contact me.